The co-presenter today is Annabelle Pinnington. She's a senior assessment manager and a colleague of mine from the multi-level testing division. The two of us have been working closely on developing new task types for online speaking assessment. The talk we are giving today is about assessing oral mediation skills via computer-based speaking tasks. Mediation may be a new construct to the audience, as it is typically not assessed in face-to-face speaking assessment. We will gradually unfold this idea throughout the presentation. In this talk, we begin by discussing the context of the study, particularly why we decided to assess mediation. Then we define what mediation means and illustrate one task called recommendation that we developed to assess this construct. In what follows, we report the validation study on the new task type and end with a discussion of the findings. In 2018, the Council of Europe published a new companion volume of CFR to expand on the concepts and descriptors that were not fully developed in the original CFR guideline published in 2001. A key concept that the new companion volume refined was mediation, and once again, the book emphasized the critical role that mediation plays in communication. So given the importance of mediation to speaking, we decided to develop new computer-based speaking tasks to assess this construct. And the goal of this research was threefold. First, we'd like to make the speaking tasks sort of interactive by asking candidates to receive input, process and evaluate the input, and then produce speech based on the information received. Second, assessing mediation allows us to refine the concept of task achievement in the human rating rubric, since mediation is associated with specific task functions and the desired goals of communication. Third, the development of the mediation descriptors in the companion volumes heavily drew on experts' collective knowledge, experience, and observations. You may argue this construct theory of mediation requires empirical validation, so we'd like to collect learner performance data in the assessment context to validate these descriptors. Now we need to consider what the mediation construct means. Mediation is about making communication possible between persons who are unable, for whatever reason, to communicate with each other directly. That is to say, mediation is about relaying information. It is also about acting as an intermediary between interlocutors who are unable to understand each other directly. So mediation is about interpreting information and facilitating the communication. Typical mediation activities include translation or interpretation between two languages, paraphrasing, summarizing complex information, reformulation of a source text, performing an evaluation of the source information, etc. It is notable that the process of mediation may be either interactive or non-interactive. In our research study, we only consider non-interactive mediation in line with our current speaking task format. We argue that integrated speaking does not directly translate to the assessment of mediation, and that mediation is a special form of integrated speaking. For example, an integrated speaking task may ask a candidate to express his or her opinion on a conversation, instead of relaying the conversation to a third party. Frost and colleagues 2012 investigated a prototype listening to speak task and found that test takers, regardless of proficiency, overwhelmingly reproduce source text information idea unit for idea unit rather than paraphrasing or summarizing the information. Huang and colleagues 2018 found that learners still drew on a significant amount of prior knowledge in responding to integrated speaking tasks. In these two cases, mediation skills are not elicited by integrated speaking tasks. We developed 4 different task types to assess mediation skills, but due to the time constraint, we will focus on one task type in this talk. The task focused on today is called making an informed recommendation to a friend. In addition to speaking, it requires a candidate to listen to a request and reading information presented in various modes. The listening time is 30 seconds, reading time is 60 seconds, and the speaking time is 90 seconds. The skills being assessed in the task include expeditious reading and matching requirements, evaluating, synthesizing, and presenting information. The relevant CFR sub-skills being assessed include acting as an intermediary in informal situations, translating text in speech, processing text in speech, and explaining data in speech. And now I'm handing over to Annabelle, who will illustrate the task in more details.
Thanks, Jing. So here's an example of the task type which we developed as seen by the candidates. First, they see and hear the rubric. They're told that they received a voicemail and some information from a friend who needs their help to decide about something. They have to listen to the voicemail, then look at the visual information. They have 1 minute to look at the information, and then 90 seconds to speak and provide a recommendation to their friend. So for this example, the friend is wondering whether they should take a specific programming course. They provide some relevant details. They want to prepare themselves for a career as a data scientist, and they outline some key requirements. So for example, they understand all the basics, but they have a busy schedule. They're then shown the visual input, which is information about the programming course. The visual input is organized in 3 sections. This is the overview. This contains a lot of information, some of which is directly relevant to the friend's requirements. Here, for instance, the course length and some key requirements like attend every class. The second set of information is metrics about the course, which includes some data being presented, such as the overall course rating, student satisfaction in some areas, and some percentages, again with some information directly related to the friend's requirements. The last section, which we think is the most interesting, contains some comments from past students. This is intended to emulate the kind of information which the candidates might see on a regular basis in the real world, on the internet, for example, on review sites. They're interesting because they can provide the candidate with some conflicting information. Here, for example, one of the comments mentions that the class is easy, but another one says you're likely to fall behind if you don't put in the hours. They're subjective opinions which the candidates needs to read through to get a full picture of the course and therefore be able to respond to the prompt effectively. We thought it was vital for this task to explicitly communicate to examiners what task achievement meant in order to standardize marking. So we defined it using what we call functional competency descriptors. To successfully achieve the task, candidates have to relate their recommendation to the requirements which were found in the audio input, so the voicemail, as well as link ideas from across the visual input. So putting, for example, the comment in contrast with the metrics to either confirm or contradict one of the subjective opinions. They also have to use an appropriate register. As we try to provide a relatively authentic scenario, we felt this was quite important. So what does that mean in terms of assigning a mark to a candidate? The first step we took was to look at these functional competency descriptors and assign an expected level of task achievement CFR levels. A C1 candidate, the target level for this task type, would be expected to fully achieve the descriptors. A C2 candidate would be expected to go beyond the descriptors, for example, tailoring a response to the audio input rather than simply making a connection. A B2 candidate would be expected to partially achieve these descriptors or attempt to without necessarily being successful. This is then used by examiners in conjunction with the linguistic performance. The various linguistic criteria, such as pronunciation and fluency, language resource, and discourse management, lead the examiner to appropriate CFR level. The examiner then looks at the expected achievement of functional competency descriptors for the level. If the linguistic level, for example, C1, matches the task achievement criteria, so full achievement, then the candidate is awarded a C1 score. If, however, the task achievement is not at the expected level, the mark is then adjusted accordingly. If the candidate goes beyond the expectation, they could be awarded a C2 if the linguistic performance was borderline C1, C2. And if the linguistic mark was borderline with B2 and the functional competencies were not fully displayed, the candidate could be awarded a B2 instead. So the research questions which we had for the study were: what are the test takers' perceptions of the task? Whether the task elicited the mediation behaviours we were hoping for, and whether the task could successfully distinguish between candidates between B1 to C2 levels. In terms of the methodology for the study, we had 340 participants across 2 stages of trialling. They had a range of proficiency levels between B1 to C2, as well as a range of different L1s, and importantly, none of them had any knowledge of the task types prior to the trial. In the first stage of the trial, we observed and interviewed 31 participants, which formed the basis of our thematic and discourse analyses, and we used ANOVA to analyse all the participant scores. So our first research question: what did the test takers think of the task? We identified 3 major themes from the interviews, the first of which had to do with the authenticity of the test construct. A number of participants commented on this, one of whom, for example, said, "I have lots of experience evaluating this kind of information, and you can't say anything wrong because it's your opinion about it." The second major theme which we saw across the interviews was that participants felt the cognitive load was quite heavy. One said, "There's so much information. I chose not to talk about the information I could read, but about my experience because that was easier." Another said, "It's a relatively short amount of time to come up with a meaningful suggestion." On the more positive side, though, we got some feedback that most participants enjoyed the task. "I enjoyed finding which information was important and that I could match the needs, like a puzzle." So overall, we found that test takers thought the task represented real-life scenarios. They did, however, find it cognitively demanding, which is something we're going to have to look into. But despite that, they still found the task engaging, which is great news. So that's what they thought about the task, but did we find any evidence of the task eliciting mediation behaviours? So here's a partial transcript of a B2 participant. She starts with an overall evaluation. The scores is not bad. She then goes on to justify that statement, mentioning the quality of teaching and the high level of satisfaction from students. However, there is some lack of coherence in her speech as she then refutes her assessment with a different piece of evidence, and then again, and she's simply paraphrasing the comments, but her linguistic performance is suffering as well at this point. Although she manages to conclude with a recommendation, she based it partly on the benefits of programming courses in general, rather than from the information from the input, potentially due to her inability to synthesize the information coherently. The C1 participant also starts with an evaluation, which she goes on to justify. You need more time, you need to do a lot on your own. She then adds to this by quoting some of the relevant data, the low percentages of continuing students or new career starters. This enables her to provide a more coherently presented recommendation, which she had backed up effectively. A C2 participant goes even further. She starts with her recommendation, which she then justifies in a similar way to the C1 participant, indicating that there might be some issues, specifically tailoring the response to her friend's busy schedule. She then explicitly describes the conflicting messages she's seen in the visual information. When evaluating, she attempts to present a more accurate picture to her friend, linking ideas from different sources within the visual information. So in response to the question, does the task elicit mediation behaviours? Throughout the participants' responses, we saw a range of language functions listed, specific information being relayed, language being paraphrased and adapted, information from multiple sources being synthesized, and information being analysed and evaluated. And for the third research question, I'll pass this back to Jing.
Thanks, Annabelle. The third research question concerns the discrimination power of the recommendation task. That is, can the task effectively separate speakers who we know are at B1, B2, C1, and C2 levels? The criteria measures of this oral proficiency is the participants' lingual skill speaking test scores, as well as their performances on the other mediation tasks. This figure shows the distributions of recommendation task scores across 4 proficiency groups. It can be seen that C2 speakers performed most consistently on this task, and the B1 speakers performed least consistently. Some of the B1 speakers even fell below the B1 cutoff score, indicating this is a very difficult task to them. We performed one-way between subjects ANOVA on the task score as a function of oral proficiency. After removing outliers, assumptions of normality and homogeneity of variance were met. ANOVA and the post-hoc Chaffee test suggested that each group exhibited significantly different performances except between C1 and C2 groups. On the right side of the figure, you may see the main differences between each group. The main difference between C1 and C2 speakers was 0.37, which is smaller than a half CFR band. We also investigated the reliability statistics related to the recommendation task. We first estimated inter-rater reliability using intra-class correlation coefficients. A two-way random effects model was chosen to treat both candidates and the raters as random factors, and also to take into account candidate-rater interaction. In this model, rater agreement was chosen over rater consistency, in that we care more about raters' agreement on CFR grading than their consistency in ranking the candidates. 10 raters participated in the study. Based on a subset of the data marked by all these raters, it was found that single rater reliability on the recommendation task was 0.85, and the reliability of an averaged multiple rating was 0.97. In addition, we also examined internal consistency reliability of a hypothetical high-level speaking test consisting of various mediation tasks, including the recommendation task. The Cronbach's alpha of the 7-item test was 0.945. If we remove the recommendation task from the test, alpha dropped to 0.934. This indicates the recommendation task contributes to the internal consistency of the test. A quick sum up for the research question 3 finding is that there were significant differences in test performance among B1, B2, and C-level candidates, but no difference was found between C1 and C2 candidates. Now I will have a quick discussion of the findings of this study. First, we found that mediation behaviors were elicited by the computer-based speaking task, which is good news. Such behaviors include relaying information, paraphrasing information, synthesizing information, and evaluating information. But we have to admit that there's no assessment of interaction mediation, such as checking listeners' comprehension or adapting language based on listeners' reactions. On the other hand, oral mediation seems an authentic construct based on the participants' feedback. Indeed, all of us are exposed to a vast amount of information in this digital world and are required to select, evaluate, and link information for oral production. The question is then if oral mediation is a part of the speaking construct. Interestingly, CFR treats mediation as a separate category of language skill. If mediation involves the use of multiple skills, including cognitive processing skills, the question is then how we can make claims about candidates' multifaceted mediation performance. Second, we found that we can distinguish mediation performances among B1, B2, and C-level speakers, but not so between C1 and C2 speakers. At this point, we are not certain about what prevented C2 speakers from surpassing C1 speakers. It could be preparation time, expeditious reading ability, familiarity with the topic, or simply the sample size of the C2 group, which is underrepresented in this data set. We are also aware of some construct irrelevant variables that may affect mediation performance. One of them is preparation time, considering the amount of information that candidates have to process in preparation for speaking. The question is, how long is adequate? In addition, Several other factors may have an effect on candidates' processing of input, including the level of language used by the input, the presentation of the materials on the screen, the easiness for candidates to navigate through different sources, and the logical links among the source materials. These questions will need to be further investigated in the future. At last, we would like to thank CRELLA for giving us this opportunity to share the study with colleagues in the language testing community. We are now opening the floor for questions.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Jing. And I have a big apology to make. I realised that I've deviated from the programme.
Right, I realised
in
that
my
too.
nervousness, I'm very sorry. And to anybody who's dialed in at specific times to listen, I'm really sorry. My sincere apologies. I have changed the schedule in error, and we've just heard from Jing and Annabelle at Cambridge Assessment from John Field. I am going to, we will go to John next, and I am really sorry about that. And Jing and Annabelle, I'm so sorry that I put you on the spot. Very short notice there. I appreciate
It's all right. I was a little bit confused because I just came back from the break, but I think I will just follow the moderator's instruction.
Sorry. I'm not a very
right.
good moderator, am I? I'll never make a radio host at this rate.
It's
Okay.
all right. I think all of us can actually listen to recording, even though the order is different. So there will be a recording available on the CRELLA website.
Yes, there will.
Right?
All of the presentations will be available on our website. And just to let everybody know, I will be sending out a link to the recordings when I post them on our webpage. I'm hoping to get that done before the end of the week. I will send out an email to everybody who has attended or was due to attend, and everybody who requested a place but was unable to come because we were full. I will actually send out a link to, so that you can find the recordings in due course. Now, if you wouldn't mind, Jing and Annabelle. I'm not sure whether Annabelle's voice, how Annabelle's voice is today, so I'm not sure whether Annabelle will be able to answer.
I think she's with us today and she's not feeling well, but I think she can answer the question.
Sorry, hi, I'll do my best. I think there's some questions there for me there.
Okay, thank you, Annabelle. That's really appreciated, and I hope that your voice gets better soon. Okay, the first question we've had, and this comes from Alina Reed. How did you decide that 60 seconds would be the time allowed for candidates to read the written input for the task?
So the task, the target candidature for this task is actually C1, basically. So an L1 average reading speed is about 200 to 300 words a minute, and input comes to about 280 words usually. So it's between 280 and 300 words in the input. So we thought that was sensible. It's actually higher for I think university level reading is supposed to be faster than that as well. So we tried to find something that was a bit of an average.
Yeah. Do you think that the difference, because that information, I wonder whether, I must admit, when I listened to your presentation, I looked at the information that they had to read. I did wonder whether, because the information is in bullet form, as it were, you know, that it's not all of it is in, if you like, continuous prose or continuous sentences. I wondered whether that might make a difference to how long it takes somebody to be able to not just to read the information, but to kind of maybe remember it a bit and absorb it.
So what we tried to do was, across the 3 sections of visual input, was to have a variety. So some is prose, some's bullet points, like I said, some's numbers, really, to try, because it's the kind of thing that you would have to engage with if you were trying to evaluate information in a, you know, when you're checking a review for anything.
Yes.
it's for the pros, it's going to actually be harder because you have to fight through the white noise of all of the words that aren't relevant. We try to find a balance.
Okay,
right, I think
lovely, thank you.
Right, we deliberately kind of make the format easy to process. So the bullet points actually help the learners to navigate through the information. It's a skimming and scanning reading activity, not supposed to be an extended reading activity as a reading speaking prompt.
Okay, lovely. Thank you very much. Thanks. That's brilliant. And the next question comes from Andrea Reves, so, our first presenter, and she's asking if you could tell us a little bit about why you chose to use linguistic rating criteria, if the decision is primarily made based on functional adequacy. So if she's correctly understood your scoring procedure, she's added.
Well, I think it's a question for Annabelle.
So it's a really interesting question, and it's something that we talked about a lot, how to actually assign marks to this task. And it's interesting because in some of the questions that came afterwards, people were saying, well, is this, task achievement if you don't talk about this, that, the other? I mean, primarily, this is supposed to test language, so to not use linguistic criteria as the primary way of assigning a score would be a bit mad, and it would certainly not be an English language proficiency test. It would be a different kind of proficiency test. But what it is the decision is not based primarily on the achievement of the task. It's adjusted by achievement of the task. So you would get marked up or down based on that once you've got your linguistic criteria looked at. So let's say if you were purely judging on linguistic criteria, then you would get a score relevant to that. However, if you manage to do particularly well in the task achievement, you might get your mark bumped up to a slightly higher level, or vice versa, bumped down. What we want to do is have that task achievement as a gatekeeper of the C levels, because that's what we found. All of the C level descriptors were very much about the kinds of functions that we're trying to define in the functional competency descriptors.
Okay. And that point links quite strongly to another question which several people asked. I think Lynn Williams, Irina, Elisio all asked. So can you just clarify for us what happens if a participant, rather than using the source materials that you've provided, talks about their own experiences? So, for example, if they did that extremely fluently and very well, what happens to their grade? How does that, but they don't reference the source materials, what happens to their grade?
So that's the point. The functional competency descriptors define that you need to talk about the inputs. So if you were speaking at a C1 level, but you did not refer to the scores at all, you might get marked down to a B2 because you've not achieved the task. That's for borderline cases. But like I said, adjustment based on the functional competency descriptors. So this is a problem that all speaking tests have. How much do you take into account task achievement? If they're speaking, well, didn't want to take away from the ability to showcase language proficiency, but equally, in the case of high-level tasks, there needs to be an element of task achievement. Otherwise, it's not clear what level of engagement the candidate has had with the input.
Yeah. Okay, lovely. Thank you. Go ahead, Jing.
Yeah, right. I think Annabelle explained everything. So we really want to use the functional competency as a gatekeeper for distinguish between C-level and B-level candidates, because we found that some candidates didn't actually speak up to the topic. They should be penalized somehow. But this new functional competency measure actually is a secondary criterion in making such adjustment. So it's unlikely you will be able to get C if you're not actually responding to the topic or fulfill the requirement. And also, we are thinking about training the auto marker with this new measure. It's creating data, because we used to train the auto marker, speech auto marker, on linguistic performance, and we need some new measures on topic relevance. This kind of new measure actually creates data for auto marker training.
Okay, lovely, thank you. And there's also just one more question here, and I think it's probably the last question I'm going to ask you, just so you know that I won't be grilling you relentlessly. But we've also got, again, from Alina and Alicia, asking about how the B1 participants managed. So perhaps if you just say a few words about that, and also just a couple of words, if you would, about whether you see this type of task being able to function at lower levels, perhaps at A2.
Right. Actually, this task is not designed for low-level candidates. I will let Annabelle explain more, but if you look at this figure on the screen, actually the B1 candidates actually perform quite inconsistently. Some of them actually drop down to B1, to A2, even A1. They cannot handle the heavy cognitive load during speaking. So it's not really designed for below B1 candidates. Annabelle, would you like to add something?
This is the thing. So B1 ability very mixed anyway. So you get your lower B1s and your higher B1s will be having very different levels of proficiency anyway. So we saw a range of complete lack of inability to understand the input, which is fair enough, and therefore a complete lack of performance. So rather than just speaking at all, they just kind of froze. So this is not something I really want anything lower than a high B1 at the very lowest.
Do you think that it's a very interesting format of test, and do you think that with altered input materials, with perhaps less content to cope with, do you think it's a format that you could see being adapted to lower levels?
So it's interesting because the concept of mediation, I think, can certainly be one that is exploitable for lower levels. With a different kind of input, different kinds of reading loads, different speaking times. It's certainly the task achievement being a gatekeeper of level is something that we're definitely exploring for lower levels as well, and for slightly different task types. So any form of visual information can be said to be a mediation task. So even just describe the picture, what do you think they're doing, which is present in a lot of lower level speaking tasks. So it's possible, definitely at a lesser level than this.
I think it depends on how you define mediation. So if you define mediation as reducing complex message or relaying complex message or collating complex message, then mediation is not appropriate for low-level candidates. But if you define mediation as like describing visual information, then I think we can come up with tasks to elicit that construct. It depends on how you define mediation. But I think for this study,
there are mediation descriptors at lower levels as well, which are much more basic. They exist there, and it's exactly for non-complex or rather less complex.
Right. I think I probably have a different opinion as Annabelle here, because I think to perform a role as a mediator, you have to reach certain level of proficiency in terms of speaking. If you want to be a speaking moderator like you, Nikki, I would not expect a kind of B1, A2 candidates to be able to moderate a conversation kind of within the same language. So I would say...
Add one more thing, that there are A2 descriptors for a lot of things, which talk about like describing the weather from a weather chart or a very simple they exist.
Okay. Well, thank you